everyone's watching the same incident, one screen, but people are seeing two very different movies. And so you're either all good or all bad. You're on my team or not. For most people, that's terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
So they just shut up.
Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So in today's episode, we're going to explore some of the concerns that people are having across society and that I hear about often in therapy sessions about the world being on fire. This constitutes things that are happening in the US, that are happening abroad, that are even happening in Canada. And there's a lot of concern surrounding the way that things are approached. And I will preface this entire conversation with the fact that I tend to take my own advice. And what I mean by that is I often tell clients to stay away from the news. That can often lead to, being ignorant of the breadth of what's happening out there, but also sometimes it's not terribly helpful to know everything that's going on out there. So I say that because I tend to not watch a lot of the news. I tend to not be too up on the details of what's going on, but nonetheless, Oren has a lot of knowledge about what is happening. And I think that we can still have a constructive, productive conversation by looking at these things from a psychological perspective and the ways in which it's impacting people and why.
Right. So, we're not going to pick a bunch of hotspots around the world and give our analyses on it. We're talking more about the way that people are psychologically and interpersonally or socially approaching it. And I think the best way to sort of frame it is the master of framing, Scott Adams of Dilbert fame, who recently passed away. AI says that he's the one to whom this phrase is credited. He's the first person I heard say it many years ago, and I repeat it, which is it's the phenomenon of two movies playing on one screen. So basically, and let's bring a recent incident that has caused this. So, for example, there was that shooting of Renee Good in Minneapolis a little while ago, depending on when people watch this podcast, and everybody saw the same video of her trying to drive away with a law enforcement agent in front of her. And yet some people saw that it was that he just assassinated her in cold blood. And others said she was trying to run him over and he saved his life. So basically, everyone's watching the same incident, one screen, but people are seeing two very different movies. And the movie that people see is based not on objective reality, and basically not even on their own personal opinion, definitely necessarily, but rather what team, quote unquote, they feel they belong to. And that's what's so destructive, is that we're losing nuance. We're not able to say, for example, that, and I mean, obviously some people can, but we're hearing very few people who say, you know what, this woman, she put herself in this position. She intended to disrupt a process. Whatever she thought about it, she was breaking the law. Okay, so she should not have been there, and she definitely shouldn't have driven away, and her wife should not have said, drive, baby, drive. Okay, that puts her in harm's way. But at the same time, we should be able to say that maybe the officer who shot her, maybe acted, inappropriately or with undue force, or maybe it was justified. But let's look at the facts, not just base it on how we feel about it. Let's look at the actual facts. And those facts, even though we all think we're seeing it, the reality is when I saw people saying, look, her wheels were turned away from him. And I was like, he doesn't see those wheels. All he sees is this woman right in front of him coming at this car, in this car. And the fact that, 6 months earlier, he had been hit and dragged and suffered serious injuries in a similar situation and everything. And then others say, well, why was he standing in front of the car? That's bad training. And then, ICE themselves, they're being trained poorly. And there are so many factors going on. And I just don't hear enough people trying to incorporate and integrate them all together to say that A, B, C, and D are all true. It's either A and B have to be true or C and D have to be true. You can't have them all. And that's what I think is just sowing further division within society.
Yeah. And to take it back to what you were saying about people of the public watching the same video, and interpreting it completely different, I'm reminded of one of the most basic psychological principles, which is perspective. The way that we view something is so heavily based on our own personal perspective, like you said, our experiences, our values. Now it seems to be influenced more by, what side you're on. But I'm reminded of like the Psychology 101 exercise of, we're looking at I think the oldest one is the old lady and like the pointy nose man, where depending
Right.
on like which way you look at it and depending on your perspective, it's the same picture, but you see something completely different. So I think that really applies here at a base level. But what's interesting is when we're looking at a photo like that, I don't necessarily think that our personal values would tie into that. So again, I think that there's a very basic mechanism taking place here when people are seeing what they want to see, but it's layered in with these messages from society and what side you belong to.
And when you bring up values, and this is what is so important, and I've been talking about this for many, many years. The fact is, people are not feeling that if you disagree with my perspective, okay, instead of saying, okay, we have a different perspective, maybe one of us is right, one of us is wrong, maybe we're both right, but we're seeing only parts of the story. Instead of any of that, okay, instead of looking at perspective and opinion, so many people today, they feel that you're not attacking my opinion, you're attacking me. You're attacking my values, you're attacking everything I stand for. Okay. And with this whole, this us versus them mentality, which is another, again, very powerful psychological phenomenon, that it's rarely been this divisive or divisive, over the years. There have been times, okay, the Vietnam War was one of those times back in the 60s. It's not like this is the first time, but the fact is it's being further apart. And the problem is that more so, at least in Canada, and the States and the Western world. Okay, in other countries, this has been very prominent, which is what has led to so much strife within those countries. But more recently, it's not just that I'm on Team A and you're on Team B. So many people feel that Team B is evil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the difference. It's not just different opinions. It's you are actually evil.
Yeah, and I think that applies to so many of the things that are going on in the world. I think the most recent one is the example you gave of what happened in Minnesota, but I'm thinking about lots and lots of different examples where it is like good versus evil, but each person on each side sees the opposite side as evil and they're good. And it's so problematic for so many reasons, but also it all it does is serve to drive people farther apart and close them off to seeing any other possible perspective. And obviously, that's very, very problematic.
Well, and the further and further we're driving people away from each other, the inability to hear the other side, this is really fomenting this black and white mentality. And I think you and I have talked about this a number of times. It's one of the most famous and one of the most destructive cognitive distortions, where it's all or nothing,
Mm-hmm.
black and white. And so you're either all good or all bad. You're on my team or not. So it manifests in several different ways, one of which is if you belong to this team, then you have to agree with everything in that team. And if you agree with 99 out of 100, but there's one thing you don't agree on, then that team will kick you out. They will ostracize you. They will see you as the other side, which is so irrational. But that's how black and white thinking works, and we're seeing more of that. And let's say, for example, with the whole ICE crisis in the States. Again, I hear some people talking this way, but I don't hear that many where they say, let's go back a few steps.
Mm-hmm.
You don't like ICE agents are here. Well, why are they, flooding the towns with them? Well, because those cities and states in the first place did not cooperate. They had some hardcore criminals. They had murderers, rapists. They had so many different bad people, and they refused to hold them in custody. They refused to contact the proper authorities to say, "Hey, we have someone, an undocumented or illegal migrant or alien, however, whatever language you want to use. I'm not doing it to be pejorative. I'm just using the language." And instead of saying we have them, please come and get them and let's give them due process. They say, no, we refuse to cooperate, so we're going to let them on the streets. So you look back and when Biden, it's clear. I mean, it's undeniable. If someone denies this, they're literally denying reality that Biden let in millions and millions, maybe tens of millions of people illegally without any vetting. Okay. And so it's impossible to deny what type of risk you're creating when you're letting in people from around the world, many of whom have bad intentions, or whether it's just to scam social assistance, or whether it's to cause some severe damage to society. You can't deny that a certain proportion will be let in when the floodgates are open. So you look at that, and then the problem is black and white thinking. So it's like, well, send them all back, kick them all back. All immigrants are bad. Immigration is bad, right? It's so divisive and it's hateful, and it's just not grounded in reality. It's only grounded in a partial reality. You're only looking at part of it, but from that you're saying this is the entire reality. All migrants are bad, or no, all migrants are good. Would you let them in your home? No, but okay, there's just so much irrationality going on.
Yeah, and I guess this is a situation, what you're describing, where perhaps my ignorance of what's going on out there is problematic, because I'll use myself as an example. You are living in a border city. Going over to the States was like a normal thing that we did when I was a kid every single weekend. So I'm no stranger to going to the US. I haven't gone in a while because I hear all of these things and I'm like, oh, am I going to be targeted for something? Or I mean, I'm Canadian born and raised, but it's scary hearing all of these stories and hearing all this black and white thinking and catastrophic stories and assumptions that are being made. I think like the number of cognitive distortions that exist in here, we could go through, our entire typical list. They're all there. But nonetheless, I hear these things and I avoid going. And that stinks, because there probably isn't that much of a risk to the average person.
Right. And the reality is, again, and that would be black and white thinking. If you go, well, there's no risk. Well, for me, as a white man, I'm going to face less risk of being stopped and so on than a brown man or a brown woman, right? So, again, that's where the ignorance comes in. That's the black and white thinking. It's lack of true empathy, and we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth repeating over and over and over. Okay, that empathy. There's different types of empathy, but the empathy that we really are trying to, cultivate in people is the ability to see somebody else's perspective. You may not like it, you may disagree with it, but to at least understand where they're coming from. And that is lacking in today's society. It's just, oh, the other people are either evil or stupid, right? As opposed to, why do they think that way? Okay. And what can potentially be done to help them think a different way. Unfortunately, that latter question is not much of an answer. Okay. But at least trying to understand why the person would feel that way. So, if I have a patient who comes in and they're a total social justice warrior and they have all these, whatever beliefs, I don't challenge them. Like if they bring up and ask my opinion, I'll tell them my opinion, but I don't try to say, no, you have to change those beliefs. I try to understand, okay, what about their experience, whether historically, whether recently, what about their surroundings, the people they speak to and everything, what makes them have those beliefs, those fears, and so on. And that's real empathy. And again, you don't have to agree with it, don't have to like it, but at least try to understand it.
And I think that this encompasses as well the topic of critical thinking, which is kind of the whole point of this podcast, is where critical thinking is missing in society. And I think this is a perfect example of it, where people, to a degree, are willfully not allowing themselves to see the other perspective. I don't think it's a matter of they can't, it's that they won't. And that sounds pretty harsh, but I think that as a species, we are quite capable of seeing different perspectives and having an open mind. But there is a large level of culture, values, and so on that play into that. And I think that right now is a time where that is severely dampening people's willingness to think critically.
Well, and you touch upon something that makes it even more difficult for people to think critically. And what I mentioned a little while ago is, because we're social animals, we want to belong to some group. Okay, our quote unquote tribe.
Yeah.
It's in our DNA. Right? We are social animals. So many people are afraid. If I agree with 99 out of 100 things, and I see that one thing, which I think is innocuous, and suddenly people are looking at me like I'm the other side, for most people, that's terrifying. So they just shut up. They don't want to be ostracized. I have no such issues with that. I speak my mind freely, and I tell people. And if you don't like it, well, you know where the door is. I'm not going to succumb to your pathologies or your neuroses.
But you're also willing to talk about it. That's the difference, is that you are firm in your beliefs, and I've known you long enough that you are also very open to a discussion.
And I'm open to having my mind changed.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Whether it's one-on-one or whether it's online. And I always say that. I say here, I do it a bit brashly, okay, but I do say, here's what I see, here's what I believe, here's where it comes from. change my mind.
Yeah.
Like I'm happy to, and unlike the people who have done those change my mind segments on the YouTube,
Yeah.
where they have no intention of changing their mind,
Yeah.
right? It's not a challenge. It's a challenge, but it's not a, what's the right word here? It's a good faith challenge.
Mhm.
If I and I have had my opinions change somewhat when people tell me things. I mean, this is why, and most people don't do this. We have to be so careful. And here's going back to this whole, the division of society. Our algorithms will feed us certain content, and I always make sure to look at content from as many sides as possible. Okay? And sometimes I can't stomach it. I really, really try, but it's like, oh my gosh, what are you saying? But I want to hear it. I want to
Yeah.
understand
Hear
where they're
what the
coming
other
from.
side is saying.
Yes, and sometimes it's like, yeah, and there are sometimes I go, wow, I had no idea.
Mhm.
Okay, like, yeah, I didn't know that, and it helps me, again, foster critical thinking. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I too, I think I'm a pretty open-minded person. I'm always willing to listen to what people have to say. People have changed my mind and educated me on topics that I wasn't aware of. So I think I'm very similar in that respect. And I'm trying to think. I think the answer is quite obvious in terms of like why some people are like you and I, and why others are more susceptible to following the herd. And I think in part it comes down to perhaps a great deal of self confidence. In again values and who you are as a human being, who I am, and the fact that we're comfortable and confident in who that is.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I don't know where yours came from, but I do know that I have two parents who were very unorthodox. They were heterodox, and they were very clear. I mean, my father, he was ostracized from his community
Mm.
that he loved because he dared speak out about certain things, and until his dying days, he maintained those beliefs. When he and I would talk, because we differed a lot on certain things, he always heard me out. He didn't challenge it. And he had, when I was growing up, he gave me so much literature and material and so on to read that shaped my views. And I mean, it really sent me in a different direction than I am now. Okay, but that he was a source of that information. We didn't have the internet back then.
Mhm.
He had these photocopies of all these articles and stuff that that was underground and that people you wouldn't get in the news or anywhere else.
That's cool.
So yeah, it was very cool, and he really opened my eyes to these different ways of seeing things. So yeah, I mean, I know that's where it comes from for me and for my mother. I mean, she broke most of the norms, and she certainly was someone who, if you didn't like what she had to say, again, you know where the door is. You probably better run because you don't want to rile her up. So those were my models, and I'm
Yeah.
fortunate to have that.
Yeah, and I would say similarly, my parents were the model for that too, but in very, very different ways. So, my dad, having moved to Canada in the '60s, experienced a lot of racism, and I think in the context of the '60s and what advocacy and social justice and things like that looked like, nothing like what it is today. I hear stories about how he had to stand up for himself and combat a lot of opinions and misconceptions that people had about him, hearing the way that he handled these situations, hearing how tough he was and how he stood up to things, I think that was imparted upon me. And then couple that with my mom, who was like the kindest, most empathetic, gentle person. So, kind of seeing that juxtaposition of those two types of personalities, I think helped to model the way that I am and the way that I approach situations.
Well, we always talk about what people can, what people can do about these. So if I can sort of jump ahead to that,
Mhm.
because what you just said there, each of us, you know, we had certain ways of thinking, certain ways of acting, and everything modeled for us, whether seeing it directly or hearing about it. Okay, and I think I've said this before, but I am going to say it because if parents want to know what they can do, I'm going to tell you one thing that you can do. Which, and I've said this. It's funny because I've had people where, if you look at their history, they should, sort of predictably turn out one way, but for some reason, the things that are happening to them don't affect them as they would almost everybody else. And in many cases, they had the same. And there's only been a few people who I've seen this with. Okay, I mean, but the one story I'm about to tell. But in a number of cases, they basically had the same thing said to them in different ways that I had said to me when I was maybe about 6 or 7. I still remember, and so I tell this to parents all the time. One of the most important things my parents said to me, they sat me and my brother down. Again, I was maybe 6 or 7. It was before my sister came along. So, 6 or 7, okay? And my parents just sat us down and they said, I might even be 5, but they said, we don't know what we're doing. Okay. Okay. My mom was very young. She was 21 when she had me. So she's like, we don't know what we're doing. We're struggling. We're just like, and my father was this crazy artist. And so, and they were upfront with my brother and I. And that message from so long ago, it helped inoculate me against what everybody else does, which is if you're a normal child and your parents act in irrational ways, if they say hurtful things, if they do things that are not in your best interest, the 99.99 to the nth degree child will internalize that as
Hmm.
there's something wrong. There's
Yeah.
something wrong with me because parents are gods. You can't not see them that way.
Yeah.
And almost every child at some stage, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 60 years old, realizes, oh, no, my parents are not perfect, right? And that's a huge shock that they have to go through. Well, I didn't have to go through a shock. My parents, from the
They
youngest
set
of
the
ages,
stage from a young age.
exactly. And that just like that changed everything in me. So every time they acted a certain way, I was like, yep, pretty messed up. Okay. And unfortunately, I got a big mouth. I would tell them that. I'd call them out, never to, I should have learned that never worked out in my favor, but I would call them out almost every single time, even as a child. So the point is, um, learning that you have the ability to filter, to interpret what's going on around you, especially in the most important context, which is with your parents in the early days. Parents, I'm telling you right now, say something like that to the kids, okay? About that, we're not perfect. Encourage that conversation, that discussion. Give them self agency. Give them that ability to make those interpretations, and that can translate later on into critical thinking so
Hmm.
that, hey, my favorite news station or podcast host or whoever else is saying this, but if my parents aren't gods and are not infallible,
Hmm.
why would I think this person would be?
And I think the challenge that people will find with that is back to what we were talking about just moments ago, is that I would assume that a lot of parents don't have the confidence in their parenting to, quote unquote, undermine themselves like that. But that is the reality. And it's important for kids to see that for all the reasons that you just mentioned. And it's okay for them to know that because it is going to have such a profound impact in their ability to view the world around them.
Exactly. And so to view the world around them and to also understand themselves,
Hmm.
and so that they aren't, they're not internalizing the wrong messages. And by the way, when you say confidence, exactly, you and I have talked about this several times. I can say, and I say it to my kids, like I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. I apologize for all these things. But at the same time, and this is totally different discussion, but it's just one thing that would be remiss if we didn't say it. There's still a hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So I just want people to understand that. Yeah.
We're
Okay.
not all
I,
friends. We're not all equal. You're still the parent. Yeah.
Exactly. I may be flawed
Yeah.
and you may be able to challenge certain things, but in the end, you have to understand that hierarchy. And which, by the way, a little side note, when we look at what's going on in society today, so many of the young people haven't been taught that hierarchy,
Yes.
whether it's
Yeah.
parents or through the schools.
Yeah.
Okay. They learn that they have this power. So then they will do things that, a few years ago, you go, what the hell are you doing? You're trying to interfere with a police officer arresting
Mhm.
somebody. You don't even know the story and you're just going in there and so on. And you think there's going to be no consequence, which, by the way, little
Because
side
there
note here.
aren't
Well,
anymore,
there
not to the same
there often
degree.
aren't. Yeah, there often aren't. And just one thing, just a little side note, I have to say it, because people are commenting on this. A lot of the people who are agitating, the ones who are like just getting in the faces of the police officers or ICE or whoever else, so many of them are women. Okay, and these are often
Interesting.
white women. Okay, and I'm saying this for a reason. Okay, these are women who probably had never had any physical adversity. All right, in the sense of guys, we learn pretty quickly. You open up your mouth, you shut, you say the wrong thing or whatever, you get
Yeah.
pounded. Okay, you learn that hierarchy really quickly.
Yeah.
We learn you don't, this is the old saying, you don't write a check that your mouth can't get,
Yeah.
or something like that, right? So, and these women never learned that. So they just don't have, this is just not part of their
But
processing. Thinking like
so,
this.
okay, I hear you,
Yeah,
and I'm sorry to cut you
sure.
off there, but I'm just
Yeah.
thinking, like, I think, though, to a degree, women
Hmm.
do learn that because, like we've talked about before, right? Young men show physical aggression, women show
Yeah.
social aggression. So I think to a degree, like, if we run our mouths as young women, we do learn pretty quickly to shut up.
I'm talking about getting into someone's face physically. Most young women don't do that. It's becoming more common
Hmm.
today. far more often. And
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying that certain segments of society, okay, they are more inclined to get into physical fights. I'm talking purely about the
Yeah.
physical.
And I guess we're saying two different things because to me, I'm converting like learning when to shut up. I'm attributing that to both a physical altercation and a verbal one. But I guess we're saying two different things.
Ironically, two movies, one screen. Yeah, yeah. No, I'm talking purely about the physical. That when your adrenaline gets pumped up and everything like that. Again, a lot of guys, as children,
Hmm.
teens, young adults, okay, we were in that situation, and it only takes a few times to
To
realize,
learn.
okay,
Yeah.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
either I got to be tougher or I got to shut up. Okay, but the women haven't had that physical experience. There's something very different. You're right about you
Yeah.
learning to shut up socially, but in that face-to-face confrontation, because they don't expect to get shoved or
Well,
punched in the
because
face.
also how convenient, and this is going to sound awful of me to say, but I'm going to say it anyways. I feel that it's awfully convenient in taking advantage of the fact that men learn you don't hit a woman, you don't fight physically
True.
back to a woman. And, unfortunately, sometimes that does happen. But for the most part, that's the generally accepted rule. So I almost feel like these women are taking advantage of that knowledge.
Well, they are, whether it's conscious or otherwise, they certainly are, and that's why they're so surprised. And it's like again, like it, it's almost comical when you watch them. The FAFO, they effed around, they found
Yeah.
out. Okay, and you think logically, how could this person not realize that? Okay, that this is a potential outcome. Well, again, because if you haven't had that experience, if it's not being part of your narrative, then it's amazing how irrationally or compartmentalized
Yeah.
people can be.
Yeah.
And that's so. Again, it's a bit of a tangent, but the point is, all of these factors can help explain why we're seeing the kind of chaos that we're seeing. Why we're seeing things that seem so irrational. And and by the way, and back to this whole point about them getting in people's faces and everything, just to tie it back together. Okay, they're not thinking, okay, I am interfering with law enforcement. Okay, they're thinking I am stopping the Nazis. Like it really what they're thinking. So it's worth the sacrifice, or
Yeah.
whatever. Or someone typed something really nasty online. I am saving the world from the Nazis with my my little post here. Right. That's what people are deluding themselves into believing in many
Mhm.
cases.
Yeah, and,
Anyway.
and at the risk of sounding overly obvious to our listeners here, like I know we started by speaking about the problematic behavior that's happening in the world and these big events that we're hearing about here in North America. But what it comes down to is more about the emotional, psychological processing of, again, the world around us, what's happening, what, our stance is, what our rights are, and on and on and on. So, the behavior is a symptom of all of these things that we're discussing.
Right. And forget about, like, I'm not saying to be ignorant. I'm not saying to not care. I'm not saying to not have empathy, but forget about trying to save the world. I always tell this to patients, okay? Because it's disempowering, it's disheartening, it's distressing when you are powerless to do anything about it. 99.99 to the end, a degree of the existence has nothing to do with you, or you have no impact on it. So I always say, focus more on what I can do. Okay, maybe this war is not going to end, or this bad person is not going to be sent to justice, whatever. But I say, don't forget that. Focus on, if you want a better world, right? How can you be a decent person, an empathetic person, a caring person to the people around you in your tiny slice of the universe? I say focus on that, because that's where self-agency comes in, and that's where you can have a positive impact. Maybe it's only on one or two people, but it's better than zero, and it's something that's under your control. Main thing, it's under your control versus the rest of the universe that is not.
Absolutely. So, to our listeners, we want to hear what you think about this. Did this shift your perspective? Are you able to look at things a little bit differently and recognize the power that you do actually have in these situations? Let us know in the comments.
Right. And on that empowering note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.